Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AWS Nordics Office Hours with me, Gunnar Grosch. I am a developer advocate here at AWS, and this is our usual weekly show where we bring on AWS experts to talk about a specific topic and let you ask any questions you might have around that. So if you do have any questions, you pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer those questions. And if we don't get your question straight away, don't worry, we'll try to put them in where it makes sense in the show. And every week, as I said, we're joined by an AWS expert. And this week, I am joined by Stefan Krist, who's a solutions architect at AWS. And we're going to talk about database migrations using native AWS tools. So, Stefan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gunnar. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Tell us a bit about yourself first, Stefan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like you've said, my name is Stefan. I'm a solutions architect based in our Oslo office in Norway. I've joined AWS about 2 years ago. It's going to be 2 years to the day on Friday, actually. My anniversary is coming up. And I've been, helping customers across all sorts of verticals, enterprise customers down to startup customers across the whole spectrum that we have to offer here in the Nordics. So it's been a really interesting journey over those 2 years.
Right. So as I mentioned, the topic for today is database migrations and using native AWS tools. So tell us about database migrations, Stefan. What kind of migrations do we typically see?
Yeah, so when it comes to database migrations, we're really looking at a two-step process. What we generally see is that customers convert the schema first. So that's the table layout. You have your table set up with certain columns. They have certain data types. You have your primary keys, your foreign key constraints, and these kind of things that makes up the schema. So you migrate that first from your target database to from your source database to a target database. And then comes the second step of the migration, which is the data part. So that's all the rows that fill up those tables where you have the different columns with the different data types. And generally,
go ahead.
Yeah, we have two different database migration types. So we have the homogeneous database migration, which is where let's say you're migrating from a PostgreSQL to a PostgreSQL database, or we also have the heterogeneous migrations, which is where you're changing the database engine in the process. Let's say you're migrating from a Microsoft SQL server to an Amazon Aurora for MySQL, for instance.
Right, so where do we typically see that customers are migrating from? Is it from their on-premises solution or from something they're running themselves as EC2 instances?
Mm-hmm. We generally see both of those worlds coming into, let's say, the RDS platform, which also encompasses Amazon Aurora. So I think what we more commonly see is a definite shift between technologies. Customers want to switch away from the database engines that have sort of licensing terms around them that bind you to like a 3-year agreement or these kind of things. They want to be able to spin up a database, use it right away, and if they're done with it, terminate it without being bound for years to a certain license. So these kind of migrations we see a lot, where a customer is migrating away from, let's say, an Oracle database engine or the Microsoft SQL server to something that's more free and open to use, be that a normal open source database like our RDS for MySQL or PostgreSQL, but also more heavily even to Amazon Aurora, our sort of more cloud native database engine that's also PostgreSQL and MySQL compatible.
So this is the database freedom that we've heard Andy Jassy talk a lot about in his reInvent keynotes, for instance.
Exactly that. Yeah, we're seeing a huge shift in that, and we're also accelerating that shift. So if you're, for instance, a customer that is looking to migrate from one of those database vendors, let it be Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server, to let's say Aurora or another database engine, we actually have a program called Database Freedom, where we can give you some credits to run this, and just sort of financially support you in that migration as well. So if you're in that position, feel free to reach out to your AWS account team, and we can help with that as well.
Right. So first, you mentioned schema conversion. So let's talk about schema conversion. How do customers do schema conversion today?
Yeah. So there are really two options. So number one, if it's a homogeneous migration, then you can stick to the native tooling, and that's something we recommend as well. It makes it much easier if you're just using the PostgreSQL or the MySQL tooling to migrate from that same database engine to another. But if you're not doing that, if you're migrating to a different database platform, then it's really handy to use the AWS Schema Conversion tool. And that makes it easy to do that migration, where it basically translates from the SQL dialect that the source database is using to the SQL dialect that the target database engine is using. So you can easily make that switch with this schema conversion tool.
And what is the schema exactly?
So like I mentioned before, it contains things like your tables that make up the database, but it also includes stored procedures or user-defined functions and maybe triggers and these kind of things. Everything that happens around the database tables as well, that all encompasses into what we would then refer to as the schema. And the schema conversion tool can pick up all of those things and migrate it from one to the other.
All right. So we're 6 minutes into the session. If you just joined us now, we're talking about database migrations using native AWS tools. I'm joined by Stefan Krist today. And well, 7 minutes in now, I think it's time to open up your screen share and show a bit about schema conversion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you. So what we've got here is basically you can see it here in the address bar, maybe. It's the SQL immersion day.workshop.aws. You will get that URL later on as well. But basically, this is a particular lab in this immersion day where we're actually going to be migrating a Microsoft SQL server that's sitting on an EC2 instance, so on your own private self-managed server. We're going to migrate that to an Aurora for MySQL database that's managed by us. So you can see a little bit here in the workshop how it talks about there is a jump server involved, there is an SQL server involved, that's the EC2 instance, and then the Aurora for MySQL instance. So we can see that a little bit here on this EC2 console. So I have the jump server that I'm logging onto via RDP. And then there's also the database server, and they both sit in this network. So we're going to jump onto this jump server, then log on to this normal database server, and we're going to migrate it to this Aurora serverless Aurora for MySQL database. So that's basically this part of the workshop, and yeah, I think that's a really good example and something we can do.
Is that a common migration we're seeing?
Absolutely, yes. It's either to Aurora MySQL, or I would say for PostgreSQL, we see it a little bit more often, simply because I think PostgreSQL can be a bit stronger in certain aspects when it comes to like enterprise database qualities. But yeah, it's definitely a very common migration we're seeing to migrate away from the Microsoft SQL server to one of the Aurora instances. Yeah. So this is just the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, and I've got a bunch of selects here. So basically, we have one database, and it's called SampleDB, and in there we see those 4 tables. And this query basically says, okay, give me a count of each of those tables. So when I run this, there we go, execute. You could see the results set before, but this is just to show, okay, we have some 20,000 rows in this table, 23 here, 504, and yeah, a lot of sales. So we're going to be migrating this database from the SQL server over to the Aurora for MySQL. And the first step we should be doing with this is to convert the schema. Now, I have this already open here. This is what the schema conversion tool looks like when you first open it up, and you basically haven't got any project open whatsoever. So the first step would be for us to click up here on File and then New Project. We can give this project a name, but I'll be lazy. I won't do that. I'll just leave it as this default. And you can see here we've got multiple options. So there is an OLTP, the online transaction processing databases. So that includes things like the Azure SQL database, DB2, Oracle, PostgreSQL, and so on. If we were to switch this to OLAP, the online analytics processing, then we're looking at migrating data warehouses and things like that. So the selection here changes, right? You can see there's Teradata, Amazon Redshift is supported, and IBM Netezza, and a whole bunch of others. And even for NoSQL, we support from Cassandra to the Amazon DynamoDB. These are the valid options there.
So we mentioned that this migration from MS SQL to Aurora is a common one. There's a question in the chat. Is Oracle DB migration a rare case?
It is a rarer case in my experience, but take that with a grain of salt, right? I have the overview of the customers that I've worked with. I don't have an AWS-wide or Nordics-wide overview, but in my experience, yes, this migration is more common than an Oracle migration.
Right, so rarer at least, but perhaps not rare.
Yes, yeah, exactly right. Out of the migrations that we are seeing, definitely it's a good split between Microsoft and Oracle. Okay, so we'll stick to the online transactional processing databases. And like we said, it's a Microsoft SQL server. And then here, the target databases are, well, they're listed here. There's a few of them. But for us, we're going to be sticking to the Amazon Aurora and then the MySQL compatibility. So once I have selected this, I simply click on OK, and then not much actually happens. So here is where I then need to go in and do some things. The first thing to set up is some global settings for this project. So I can click onto here, and you can see, like, I can set up some logging. There's some performance and memory levers that I could tweak. But the main bit I need to do is actually set up these drivers here. So I've done that before. Because this is part of the SQL Immersion Day, I have the JDBC drivers neatly installed here in the C drive, and I just select them. So you can see I have one driver for the MS SQL JDBC connection, and I have one for the MySQL connector. So basically, you can specify which driver to use. Obviously, here, this is the Microsoft SQL Server path. That's where the MS SQL jar file lives. And here under MySQL, I've selected the MySQL one. This is an important bit, especially when it comes to like data warehouse migrations, because if you look at here an IBM Netezza or any of those, the driver might not be a given. Sometimes you can purchase a specific driver from one of those vendors, and then you can select that version that you have that you know is going to work with your data warehouse. So it's a neat little feature that you can define where those drivers live. So like I said, this is now done. The next thing we can do is simply connect to the Microsoft SQL server. You'd already remember this from before, but the IP address for the server, because this is set up in a VPC that gets auto-provisioned as part of the SQL Immersion Day, the IP address is here 10.151.10.100. The username is anything with that red corner here, we need to specify. The username is simply AWS SCT for Schema Conversion Tool. And then I'll type in the password, which is it's very simple, AWS SQL 29. And I probably had a typo in there. Also test the connection first. Okay, yeah. This time I typed it correctly. So what happens now is the Schema Conversion Tool is scanning my source database, and it's looking at certain things like what does the schema look like, how many stored procedures are there, but it's only loading like the metadata of that. Why that is important is because the Schema Conversion Tool does what's called lazy loading. So only when I actually click around on the source database will it load certain values. tells me here that some fetching was interrupted, and I can look at the log for details, but that's intended. I don't need to dive deeper into that. So what we can see here are the two databases, and then as I expand this, now it's actually querying the database. So it didn't read the entire schema before. And the point of that is, if I add this as a source to my schema conversion tool, I don't want my database server to be completely hammered by lots of queries, as in how many tables are there, how many rows in each table, what do the stored procedures look like, and all that. So that only happens when I actually click on things here. So this is basically the source view on the right here, sorry, on the left. And then we can also connect to the target Aurora database. Again, this is kind of pre-filled here, but I'll remove that, and we'll switch back to the to this browser here, and I'm gonna actually pick the endpoint directly from here. So I'll just copy this, switch back to my RDP session, and then I paste it in here for the server name. So this is the endpoint for our target Aurora for MySQL database. And then again, it allows me here to specify the password. And for simplicity, as part of this workshop, they're all kept at the same AWS SQL 29. Okay. Now it's telling me here that the database version is less than what is recommended. We don't have to worry about that. We can just click that away. So here on the right-hand side, I now have my target database and things that it would be applying. Now, one of the really good advantages of the schema conversion tool is that I can create a report of what that migration may look like. So I simply select a database and say, create report. And now it's scanning more objects than it scanned before. So obviously, to create that report, the lazy loading doesn't quite work, right? It needs to actually access what is there. But after a few seconds, we get this nice looking report with an executive summary about what can be done automatically and which apps require a manual intervention. I also have like some nice visual representation of that here. So all these things, the schema can be converted. I have 5 tables that can be converted without problems. There are 9 constraints that, green basically means they can be automatically converted. Red here means there are objects with complex actions that we can't automatically migrate. And in our stored procedures, we see that quite well. So there are 10 stored procedures in total, and 7 of them can't be migrated without any manual intervention. 3 of them can. And this is really where the schema conversion tool shines as well. I've had this before with customers. They just wanted to escape their licensing agreement. So they ran this report for Amazon Aurora for MySQL. They ran it for Amazon Aurora for PostgreSQL. They ran it for, name another database server. Basically, they determined where they're going to migrate to based on the least path of resistance, because they just had to migrate urgently before a license renewal took place. So for them, this was a godsend. They could just work out, okay, for this database type, we have the least amount of work with this migration. And that's where these reports come in really, really handy.
And this example you had now, where 7 out of 10 needed some type of manual, is that common? Or based, of course, it depends as usual, but based on the normal way our source databases look, is it common that you have manual intervention needed?
Yeah, I think I have to defer to it depends, unfortunately, in this case. So we see this sometimes. I would say if you're just using a database for minimal things, you don't have any complex stored procedures or other functions or triggers, then you can expect the migration to be fully autonomous. I think in this example, it is picked because we can now work with some procedures that can't be migrated automatically. Right. So for the most part, the migration should be fully autonomous, really. But I've also worked with customers that really push the database engine to its limits, and then they have more of these manual intervention steps. Yeah. You have some functions here like exporting this to a CSV file or a PDF, so you can present this to management and make your case as to why you should migrate to one database engine and not the other. And then you also have some action items here, which is really nice. So you can see what is going on with the different issues. So these are the 7 stored procedures that couldn't be migrated. And I can then look in here. Okay, it is, the name is STP, stored procedure, and then city health resource request report. I can sort of drill deeper and see what the actual issue is. And it tells me here the scope, table variables and temporary tables is different. You must apply a manual conversion if you're using recursion. So for DBA, this is really important knowledge. There's also a link as to what this, some more information, what this means, and where you can get further information on how to fix these things. We can also then jump around here and, let's say, look at maybe a few tables. If I select one, I can see this is what the create statement looks like on the source side. And then if I go here and open the same, I don't see that here yet. Anyway, you can then also see that here on the target side. But let's focus on the problems that we're having. So it was 7 stored procedures. You can tell it's nicely represented here with this visual exclamation point that tells us, okay, these stored procedures can't be moved. So what I can do is I could just untick that and select those that can be moved. Right? There's another one that could easily be moved. I can then say right-click here and say convert schema. Now it warns me that those objects may already exist in the target base, but we're happy to replace them if that's the case. And now we can see here the store procedures have also been migrated over. See now, this is the side-by-side view I wanted to show before. So this is the SQL from the source, and then it's automatically translated this into the SQL dialect of the target. You can see that that function is a lot shorter, and yeah, it just uses the database native things that that can be recycled. So it takes a lot of the heavy lifting off your hands. And another feature is I could now modify this and basically change how this looks. Then the advantage is I could also not just do a plain old migration. I can also, include an update in that and make that target database behave differently than the source, if that's something that you've been putting off, like some kind of update. But you could also include that into the migration as you apply this. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to show. Another thing we could quickly touch on is the Schema Conversion tool also supports migrating an application. So what I can do here is I can say I have a Java application or C++, C#, or really any source code. And what it can do is it will scan your code base and then find any SQL query that you have there as a plain old string. It will find that and migrate it from the source dialect to the target SQL dialect. So you can also migrate your Java app that is accessing the database, which is, I think, a pretty neat feature. It has, of course, some limitations. It can't, if you're using an abstraction library, where you say query those 2 fields for this target database, maybe with this where clause and all that, and you do all that programmatically, then the Schema Conversion tool can't help with that. You have to, work with the target or with that abstraction library for your database to see how you could be migrating. But for normal operations, it will work really well. Another thing where it has issues with is if you're concatenating your strings to build SQL queries, it also will have trouble identifying those and sort of, migrating those to the target SQL dialect. But for complete strings, it will do its magic. Okay, we can see here tables and views, procedures and functions would all be automatically applied. Actually, let me quickly, I think this shouldn't be here. Let me refresh this from the database. So that's now gone. And I think I need to select this up here and then say convert schema. Yeah, I would have expected this to be in here as well. That brings me actually to another interesting thing. We can set up mapping rules as part of the migration. This is actually happening in the immersion day as well. So we'll be selecting a schema here. And the cool thing is what you can do is you can say where a database name is like, and then you can set up your own rule. You could say like add a prefix or a suffix or remove a prefix or a suffix. So we could say remove the prefix DBO. Let me just quickly save that. Because we see this in our tables here. If I go to these tables, there's this schemas.dbo and then customers, employees, and so on. So with this mapping rule that we've just set up here, I can actually remove from any schema the prefix DBO. So that's a nice little thing that you can do with the schema conversion tool as well. And like I said, in this workshop, it talks about that. About here, I would say. This is where it sets up the connection. It creates the report. No, one further. Yeah, here it talks about the mapping rules.
Right.
To say, okay, where the database name is sampledb, remove the suffix DBO. Let's jump in there. Come on. We'll jump back here and I'll edit that and actually change that where the database is. And then it was sampledb. Call it a suffix. I shall do the same. Cool. This is how you can do that. I'll extend that again. Now, if we're ready with the migration and all that, what we can do is simply say for sampledb, apply to database. And this is what's now going to apply all the conversions and things that we've set up to the target database. So this is what's now actually migrating the schema from the source to the target database. And that was it for the schema conversion tool, really. So we now have the schema in place on the target database. And now we can use the database migration service, or DMS for short, to do the actual migration. So the schema conversion tool and the database migration service go hand in hand. I could even do things here along the lines of somewhere in those settings. I could actually apply, or I could run a DMS job in here. Let me see where I found this. Yeah.
What did you say? You can run
a database migration service job,
right,
or a DMS job. So I could pick this table. It's grayed out at the moment. Not sure why, but you can see it says create DMS task or create local task. That's basically what we're going to do now manually. You could also do this using the schema conversion tool, but then you need to specify your AWS credentials up here in the top right corner. So I don't have any IAM credentials set up, but you could use this and then basically set up the DMS tasks yourself. But we're going to do that now manually. And for that, we'll jump into the AWS Management Console and basically type in database migration service. There we go. And then let's open that in a new tab here. I'll X this away. Okay, it gives us a brief overview here of what you can do. And the first thing we want to do is create a replication instance. So the replication instance is the unit of compute that then connects to the source database to fetch all the data, and then applies those the data from the source database to the target database. So we need to give it a unique name. So we just call this replication 1. Yeah, nothing much to really say here. We can call this replication instance. It suggests a T3 medium, and that will work for us as well. We don't need to do much here. There are a few key values that you really need to pay attention to. It's not the version of DMS. It is which VPC you provision this into. So for us, as we're running through the SQL immersion day, we are in lab 4. So I want to select that VPC. I could make this a multi-AZ instance, but we don't need to do this for this quick demo. And I also don't need this to be publicly accessible. This is all self-contained in its own VPC, so there's no need to open that up to the public. And I have some advanced settings I could place here, right? Which security group and availability zone I want this to be in. But just selecting the VPC at the top is all that we need. And I can then click on Create.
So while this is creating, if you just joined us, we are talking about database migrations using native AWS tools today with Stefan Krist, Solutions Architect at AWS in Nordics. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll make sure to answer those as well. We've started out by looking at the schema conversion, and now we're on to doing the data migration.
That is correct, yeah. So while the replication instance is being created here, we can look at the endpoints. So there are no endpoints set up. This is a fairly empty AWS account, but I can create an endpoint. A big decision you have to make is between the source and the target endpoint. So we're going to set up the source endpoint first and just leave this as is. And now we know that we're migrating an MS SQL server. So I'll just type that in here. Yeah, I could give this a friendlier name. Here I select my source engine, and there we have it, Microsoft SQL Server. Now I have the option to select the secrets for this database instance from Secrets Manager, or I can provide it manually. So in my case, I need to provide it manually. We can fetch the details from here. I mean, I know the IP address, but it's just easier to click copy. So this is our private IP address. We'll type this in as the server name. The port, it's the default port for the MS SQL server, 1433. We don't need to provide any SSL here. The username is AWS SCT, and then the password again is AWS SQL29. The database name for us to migrate is SampleDB. And then I can set up some more connection attributes, or a KMS key to basically encrypt the traffic. I can test this, but yeah, we'll trust it. I'll simply hit create, and now we have the source endpoint set up. So for the replication instance later on, it needs a source and a target endpoint. So we can create a target endpoint next. I'll just call this the Aurora MySQL endpoint. And accordingly, I'll also select here Amazon Aurora MySQL Serverless, which is our instance type. Okay, then server name. This is where it asks for the specific endpoint that we've used before as well. So I'm just going to select that again. Perfect. Now the destination port for this, for MySQL, it's the default port is 3306. So I'll be using that. And for sake of simplicity, the password and username here are both the same. Right. Now, scrolling down a bit further, I have the same options here for source and target endpoint. Right. So this, whether I select one or the other, doesn't matter. And again, I click Create Endpoint. And now I have the two of them here. Okay, let's check back to our replication instance that has since been provisioned and is ready to rumble. So we can now set up the migration task. So simple here, we can click on Create Task. And given that we haven't really set up much, we just set up the bare minimum. This is going to be very, very straightforward. So we can call this migration. The replication instance, we only have the one. Source, we only have the MS SQL server, and target, yep, we only have the Aurora MySQL. So that's pretty straightforward. An interesting bit we can set up here is the migration type. So what I can do is I can simply do a full load and migrate the existing data from the source to the target database and then leave it at that. But I could also set up a what's called CDC or change data capture, which basically will replicate all database events from the source to the target database. So all transactions, which is really helpful. With a full load, you don't get the entire history of the database. You just get, okay, this value is now that. But if you set up change data capture, every time there's a transaction that touches, that row, that column, it will transmit that transaction to the target database. So you're setting up ongoing replication, basically. And the third option here is to just set up ongoing replication without doing a full load at first.
So this goes back to the strategy you've chosen for your data migration. If it's you're doing a data migration over time, for instance, you might start off by migrating the existing data and then continue to replicate ongoing changes before you actually do the switchover.
That is absolutely right, yeah. What we see a lot of customers doing is they create their target database, set it up with the Schema Conversion tool, and then they go for this option where they do a full load of the database, but then also set up ongoing change data capture. It has the advantage that they can then do tests on the target database. They can take one application out, point it at the new target database, do maybe some load testing, and just make sure that everything works as it should. And then you can define a short sort of maintenance window where you say, okay, Wednesday evening we'll cut over, and you know that the database has been replicating all of its values up until that point. So it's very easy to just change all the applications in one go and point it at the new target database. And you minimize the window of downtime. So you don't have to have your website or your web application in read-only mode while you do the migration. You can actually leave it up and running up until that point, change the application to point to the target, and then suddenly all transactions will only go to the target database, at which point you can turn off your source and you no longer need to keep that running. So
how is it doing the ongoing changes? Is it doing that continuously, or is it in chunks, windows?
Yeah, it does it continuously. So it doesn't batch up the transactions or anything. As soon as something goes towards the bin logs, then it will take those and send it to the target database.
Right.
Yeah. So as you're doing this, it also makes sense to check that there's no replication lag between the two, just so that you have all the latest data in your target database as you do the handover or the migration, I should say. Yeah. So it's a very sort of feature-rich tool that you can use here. Another thing, you can set up some certain task settings. That is how to deal with large objects, or do you want to prepare any tables whatsoever. So you could drop the tables on the target, or in our case, we know we want to do nothing because the schema is already set up. And then here you can also specify some table mappings, which is really, really handy to have. And in fact, you need to specify that. So what we can do is, I need to refer back to my SQL immersion day here, just so I don't mess this up. Yeah, that's the easy bit. We could enable Cloudwatch. The trickier bit is here, what we want to do. So for the schema, DBO, any table name, we want to include that. And then we want to rename DBO to SampleDB. Okay. Here we go. We're back at the SQL, at the DMS console in the AWS Management Console. So yeah, we want to enter a schema. Schema was star. No, let me double check. Schema was DBO and table name is star. Okay. So we want to include anything in the DBO schema. That's perfect. And then we can add a transformation rule here. You can see I could also supply a column filter. So I don't have to say include anything in that schema. I could also say in that table, only migrate those columns or filter out these other columns as I do the migration. So it has a few more features that you could leverage for your migration. Okay, so, and then for the target, let's make sure we pick the right things. The target will also be a schema, and the schema will be DBO, and we rename that to SampleDB. So schema is DBO. And then we have a whole bunch of actions here, right? I could replace a suffix, remove it, add one, same with prefixes or the casing. I could make it upper or lowercase, or simply rename it to, and then, like we said, SampleDB. It's a pre-migration assessment that you could run that would warn you of any sort of issues. But given that we've used the Schema Conversion tool to do this, we don't need to run this as well. Once that task is created, do I automatically want to start it or not? In our case, yes, we want to start it. There's no need to, sort of do that manually. And that will now, that will take a little bit. So first to create that task on the migration, on the replication instance, but then also kicking it off and doing the actual migration. If we remember back to the SQL Server Management Studio, this looks like about 6.7 million rows, and then a little bit of change here, but it will take a little bit to migrate those across. So I think now is a natural place to stop for questions if there are any in the chat.
There aren't any questions right now, but I have a question for you about the replication instance. That is a fully managed instance, so you don't really have to think more about it after creating it. You don't have to log into the instance, do anything there. Everything is handled in the console, right?
That is correct, yeah. So it's fully managed in a sense, but as you saw before, you can change the size of the instance, and that is quite significant. So we have a best practices white paper, and we also have best practices in the documentation to just sort of highlight what instance size you should use for what workloads, and basically, just to give you some guidance. So while you don't need to log on to the instance and it's all self-managed, you can change the size, and you should consult the best practices to make sure that you're picking the right instance size for the workload you're targeting.
Can you change it after the initial data migration when you have it as just for the changes?
That is a good question. Let's see.
I think you had it almost at the top.
Here. Sorry, I shot way past it. So I can change it afterwards. Right. So I can start with a small one and then eventually upgrade. It's nice to see as well that the default here is, leave. That the default here is tagged as free. So that's part of the AWS free tier that gives you lots of freebies, so you can test the service without actually having to pay for it.
That's great. Question in the chat now. Can you monitor the replication instance in case you want to watch the CDC?
Yeah, so what you can do is here, you can look at the normal Cloudwatch metrics that we gather for all EC2 instances. So you can see, CPU utilization, memory, and all that is being graphed or drawn up here. Also, if you're looking at the database migration tasks, we can see a lot of details, including this progress bar that shows us how things are going. And I specifically now didn't enable Cloudwatch logging, but if I quickly click on here, that's something that's very simple to do. Enable Cloudwatch logs, and then you can specify where things go and what you want to log. So then you get even more insights into what's happening into your migration. But if you don't do anything, there we go. It just shows 100% load complete. All right. So now let me switch back to. Actually, I'll first go into this tab. So at the end of this, we want to validate that we've migrated everything. So I've already copied this into the SQL Management Studio, or Microsoft's SQL Management Studio here. Again, if I execute this, I see that this was copied successfully. I've also got Mysql Workbench set up here. And I can close this for a moment. So here I have one connection, which happens to be the Aurora target database. Yeah, it just jumped open. So what I can do here is basically paste that query in. That should simply return the values for the tables that we've created. So notice that it refers to sampledb.employees, whereas here, oopsie daisy, whereas here it refers to dbo.employees. So the migration has actually modified the table names as well as the schema names. And if we look at the data that has come across, so for customers, we see identical values for employees, products, and also sales in total. So that's really nice that, you know, it made the migration happen. It changed the table names in the process, and it worked fairly quickly in just a few minutes, really, for these, let it be 6.7 million records total.
Can we try out for now? Now you did it as a one-time migration. Can we enable changes and just try that out?
We can try. I'll give no guarantees, but
No.
Oops. It was here. Yeah. So let's create a new task. This was the full load, and we'll just call this CDC. Again, we use the same replication instance, same source, same target. We don't have much choice here. And now, given that we have migrated everything already, we can simply replicate any changes. I can select CDC start mode for source. So let's have a quick look at that. Okay, yeah, I can set a custom start, as opposed to starting as of the moment I create this task. I could also choose to replicate things that happened, you know, maybe last week or something, so that I have the full week, whatever is in my bin logs, basically. So I have that sent to the target database. I could create a recovery table for, you know, this is what the schema or the table looked like before we started the change data capture. But yeah, I think it's safe here to stick with the defaults. Let's enable Cloudwatch logs though. The reason that's not part of the default is because it occurs an extra cost to have these Cloudwatch logs there. But yeah, it doesn't hurt for this example to turn it on. And yeah, I think we should again set up the same rules. So we wanted to, yes, enter schema. The schema was DBO, and we'll simply include any table name here. And then for the transformation, we'll add a transformation and say it was the schema, where the schema name was DBO. Rename that to, and then this was sample DB.
Good memory, Stefan.
It's not the first time I've done this in recent days. But yeah, there we go. So it's creating that task. Again, we've left the default, which is to start the task as soon as it's been created.
Yeah.
So
in the meantime, let's take a question while that is creating. From previous experience, I couldn't connect an RDS endpoint until I've opened it up to the world. Is it possible without opening up?
yes, absolutely. So that is now possible, especially with the replication instance. So that's where it really matters that you select the right VPC. In this case, I mean, the EC2 instance here is not open to the world. So our, let me quickly bring up the security group. The security group really only allows anything in this internal network here. So it's not open to the world, and we can still migrate. And the same would apply to an RDS source. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't just apply to EC2 instances. As long as the replication instance has access to it, then you don't need to make it public.
Right. So choosing the right VPCs or setting up the correct security groups, the rules in the security groups.
Exactly, yeah. Or if you're in the same VPC but in different subnets, then network access control lists or NACLs also apply. So those are, I guess, the typical VPC networking that you will come across. That still applies here, yeah.
Right. Starting.
Yeah, the process has been created.
So in the meantime, then this isn't a question, but more of a comment. So this is very useful information. I have a request from a customer to migrate MS SQL RDS to MySQL. So
yeah,
good.
That's good to hear, and I'm glad this example fitted so well. So yeah, the steps I would recommend really is to set up that schema conversion tool, define your source and target database, and then just go through the report to see, okay, what is that migration going to be? Can I just click the button and it's going to be fully autonomous? Or do I need to do a bit of research on triggers, stored procedures, and these kind of things that might not automatically migrate?
Right. So now we have an ongoing replication.
Yeah.
So now if we make changes to the source,
we would expect that to be replicated.
Yeah.
So now my SQL isn't great, especially not the MS SQL. I wonder, let's try something. I'll get us a new query and say, that's probably tough. I was going to do an insert, but then I need to specify all the values.
I think you can, if you take edit.
All right. There's an edit button.
Edit top 200, for instance.
Perfect. Yeah, okay. So customer ID 1, the name we've got here is Aaron Alexander. So let's Windows. Let's change this to my name. So, then Gunnar, how do I confirm this? If I click close, will it just ask to save it?
I think it should be already updated now. When you're editing. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So that has happened. Now, if we go over to the Mysql Studio, we should see something similar. So these are all the administrative tasks. But what I can do is open up the schema here, go to SampleDB, look at the tables, in particular the customers table, and select the top 100 rows. So the change hasn't replicated fully yet. We'll give it a second and check again. I wonder whether there's any buffers we need to clear to fire off the transaction on MS SQL. I'm not 100% sure. This is really live uncharted territory.
It is. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, that's all right. These things happen.
Yeah. It's not migrated yet, but in theory, it would now then pick up on that change in the database. Oh, it actually fails.
Look at that. Yeah.
It's a permission issue on the source.
It very much looks like that, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So in terms of the permissions, what we do here is we simply create a user, and that user may not have
it's missing one of the permissions, yeah.
Yeah. I have some of these here. But yeah, I've just copied and pasted this out of the immersion day, and that's probably why we don't have the right permissions.
Yeah, but still, the migration instance picked up on the change and tried to get that change migrated, but was unable to due to permission issues. So
exactly, yeah. And
I think
we have this here. Yeah, we have this here in the logging as well, where we can see, okay, we have the relevant Cloudwatch logs, as well as the nice message that lets us easily identify what's going on. Yeah, there we go. Is not enabled for replication. Yep.
All right. So permission issue. So sorry once again for putting you on the spot, Stefan. But
that's okay. Yeah. I've learned something.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So we're reaching the top of the hour now. Any final words, some tips, best practices for people before we sign off?
Yeah, I guess for successful migrations, it's really important that you understand your database and the data within it, right? How the different tables hang together, and also understand your network. This is partly where the replication instance comes into, but also things like the database migration service, having that plugging into the right components and giving them access. So knowing your database and knowing your network or your infrastructure is going to be hugely helpful. And with the Schema Conversion tool, I would say don't be afraid to play around with it and run a few reports for different engines and see if that might sway your migration to something where it's just going to be easier for you. If your goal is to just migrate away from one server that's going to be out of warranty, or you need to renew the license, you just want to switch away in the easiest way possible, that's really something that you can do. And in general, I would say it's worth checking out the Schema Conversion tool. It even lets you migrate data warehouses, as opposed to the database migration service is really for transactions where you can get the change data capture. If you have like a SaaS data warehouse or an IBM Netezza, that doesn't necessarily apply. And the Schema Conversion tool can fill that gap. It basically takes the data out of your source data warehouse, puts it in a 3 bucket, and then issues that copy command to get it into Amazon Redshift. But yeah, that's for data warehouses.
Right. So I pasted a few links in the chat already throughout the session. And the last one was the best practices for DMS. So do check those out as well. And the services are available, so you can just reach them in the console to get started. And all right, with that, Stefan, I want to thank you very much for spending 1 hour with us. Really useful and great information. And
thank you.
Lastly, everyone, thank you very much for joining us. And this has been another edition of the AWS Nordics Office Hours with me, Gunnar Grosch, and I was joined by Stefan Krist today to talk about database migrations using native AWS tools. And see you all next week. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.